Prince William pressed his face against the cold glass window of his bedroom in Kensington Palace. The morning sun was shining bright, and the palace grounds looked peaceful and quiet. Down below, he could see the royal guards taking their positions for the day. These men in their red uniforms and tall black hats had always caught his attention. They stood so still and straight that they looked like toy soldiers from his childhood games. The 15-year-old prince had been watching these guards for many years now. Every single day they would march to their posts at exactly the same time. They never smiled or waved or even looked around. They just stood there like statues for hours and hours. William often wondered what they were thinking about while they stood so still. Did they get bored? Did their feet hurt? Did they ever want to scratch their nose or yawn? His friends at Eton College were always talking about funny things they did to get reactions from their teachers and other adults. They would make jokes or pull small pranks to see who would laugh first. William had heard all their stories during break time, and he always found them entertaining. But he had never tried anything like that himself, especially not with the palace, staff, or the guards. The young prince had a curious mind that was always asking questions. His tutors often said he was too inquisitive for his own good. He wanted to know how things worked and why people did what they did. The royal guards were like a puzzle to him that he could not solve. How could anyone stand so perfectly still for so long without moving even a tiny bit? William remembered asking his father, Prince Charles, about the guards when he was younger. His father had explained that these men were specially trained soldiers who protected the royal family. They had to follow very strict rules and could not talk or move while they were on duty. Prince Charles had told him that being a royal guard was one of the most important jobs in the country, and that these men were chosen because they were the best soldiers. The Queen had also told William stories about the guards when he was little. She said they were like knights from old times who would protect the castle and the people inside it. She explained that their red uniforms and tall hats were traditions that went back hundreds of years. The Queen always spoke about the guards with great respect and admiration. But William was not a little boy anymore. He was 15 and felt like he understood the world better now. He had read books about psychology and human behavior for his school projects. He knew that everyone had limits and that everyone could be made to react if you tried hard enough. Even the most serious adults at school would sometimes smile or laugh when students did something unexpected. The prince had been thinking about this for weeks now. Every morning when he saw the guards, he would imagine different ways to test them. He thought about telling jokes or making funny faces or doing silly dances. He wondered if any of these things would make them break their serious expressions even for just a moment. William knew that his grandmother and father would not approve of such behavior. They had taught him to always be respectful and dignified, especially when dealing with palace staff. But his teenage curiosity was stronger than his sense of proper royal behavior. He felt like he needed to know if these guards were really as perfect as everyone said they were. The guards changed their positions every 2 hours throughout the day. William had memorized their schedule perfectly. He knew exactly when each guard would start his duty and when he would be replaced by another guard. He had even learned some of their names by listening to the conversations of other palace staff. There was Guard Thompson, who was tall and had been working at the palace for many years. There was Guard Mitchell, who was younger and had only started his job a few months ago. There was also Guard Harrison, who had a small scar on his chin that William had noticed during ceremonies. Each guard had his own way of standing and holding his rifle, but they all maintained the same perfect stillness. William had tried to imagine what it would be like to stand in one place for 2 hours without moving. He had attempted it in his own room once, but gave up after just 10 minutes. His legs started to ache and he felt the urge to shift his weight or stretch his arms. He could not understand how the guards did it day after day without seeming to struggle at all. The young prince also wondered about the guards' personal lives. Did they have families and children? What did they do when they were not working at the palace? Did they laugh and joke and act like normal people when they were at home? It seemed impossible that anyone could be so serious and formal all the time. William had noticed that tourists and visitors often tried to get reactions from the guards. They would stand close to them and make funny faces or tell jokes. Some people would even try to touch the guards or ask them questions. But the guards never responded to any of these attempts. They would just stand there looking straight ahead, as if nothing was happening around them. This made William even more curious about testing the guards himself. If regular people could not get any reaction, then maybe it would take someone special like a prince to break through their training. He thought that perhaps the guards would treat him differently because he was part of the royal family. The prince had access to areas of the palace that regular visitors could never reach. He could get much closer to the guards and spend more time near them without anyone telling him to move away. This would give him advantages that other people did not have when trying to get the guards' attention. William also thought about the fact that the guards knew who he was. They had seen him growing up in the palace and had probably received instructions about treating him with respect. Maybe this would make them more likely to react to his attempts at getting their attention. As he continued to watch from his window, William began to form a plan in his mind. He would start with small, simple tests to see how the guards would respond. If those did not work, he would try more creative and bold approaches. He felt excited about the challenge ahead of him. The morning sun was getting higher and the palace was becoming more active with staff members going about their daily duties. William could see gardeners working on the flower beds and maintenance, workers checking various parts of the building. But the guards remained perfectly still in their positions like islands of calm in the busy palace environment. William decided that today would be the day he would begin his experiment. He had been thinking about it for too long and his curiosity was driving him crazy. He needed to know if these guards were really as unbreakable as everyone believed, or if they were just very good at hiding their human reactions. The prince stepped away from the window and began to get dressed for the day. He chose his clothes, carefully thinking about how he wanted to present himself to the guards. He wanted to look casual and friendly, not formal and royal. He hoped this would make the guards more likely to see him as a regular person, rather than as someone they needed to be extra careful around. As William prepared to leave his room, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He was about to embark on what felt like a great adventure right in his own home. He had no idea what would happen or how the guards would react to his attempts, but he was determined to find out once and for all if anyone could really be as perfectly controlled as the royal guards appeared to be. William walked down the long hallway of Kensington Palace with quiet steps. His heart was beating faster than usual as he approached the main entrance where Guard Thompson had just taken his position. The tall soldier stood perfectly straight, with his red uniform looking crisp and clean in the morning light. His black bearskin hat added several inches to his already impressive height, making him look even more intimidating. The prince had decided to start his experiment with the most experienced guard in the palace. Guard Thompson had been protecting the royal family for over 10 years and had never been seen breaking his professional composure. If William could get any reaction from this man, then he would know that his plan might actually work. William positioned himself about 20 feet away from the guard post. He pretended to be reading a book while secretly watching Guard Thompson from the corner of his eye. The soldier stood with his rifle held at the perfect angle, and his eyes focused on a point somewhere in the distance. His breathing was so controlled that his chest barely moved up and down. The young prince cleared his throat softly, hoping to get the guard's attention. Nothing happened. Guard Thompson continued to stare straight ahead, as if William was not even there. William tried clearing, his throat a bit louder this time, but still got no response. The guard seemed completely unaware of his presence. Feeling slightly frustrated but not ready to give up, William decided to try a different approach. He began walking slowly back and forth in front of the guard post. He made sure to stay within the guard's line of sight while trying to look casual and natural. He stopped occasionally to examine the flowers in the nearby garden, or to look up at the sky as if he was checking the weather. Guard Thompson remained perfectly still during all of William's movements. His eyes never shifted to follow the prince and his facial expression never changed. It was as if he was looking through William rather than at him. The guard seemed to be in a different world, completely focused on his duties and unaware of anything else happening around him. William found this lack of reaction both impressive and annoying. He had expected that being a member of the royal family would at least get him some acknowledgement from the guard. Even a small nod or a brief glance would have been something. But Guard Thompson treated him exactly the same way he treated all the tourists and visitors who tried to get his attention. The prince decided to escalate his efforts slightly. He began making small gestures with his hands while walking near the guard post. He waved gently at first and then more obviously. He even tried giving a small salute, thinking that this military gesture might get a response from the soldier. But Guard Thompson continued to ignore him completely. William then tried standing directly in front of the guard at a respectful distance. He looked up at the tall man's face, trying to make eye contact. The guard's eyes were focused on a point somewhere beyond William's head. The prince could see that the guard's eyes were a deep brown color and that he had a small freckle on his left cheek. But those eyes never looked down to meet William's gaze. The young prince began to realize that this was going to be much more difficult than he had imagined. He had thought that a few simple gestures or movements would be enough to get some kind of reaction. But Guard Thompson seemed to be completely immune to any form of distraction or attention-seeking behavior. William decided to try talking to the guard. He started by saying good morning in a friendly voice. When that got no response, he began talking about the weather and how nice the day was looking. He mentioned that the flowers in the palace garden were blooming beautifully and that the birds were singing lovely songs. But Guard Thompson gave no indication that he could even hear William's voice. The prince then tried asking the guard direct questions. He asked about the guard's training and how long he had been working at the palace. He asked if the uniform was comfortable and if the hat was heavy. He even asked if the guard needed anything like water or if he wanted to sit down for a moment. But every question was met with complete silence. William began to feel a strange mixture of admiration and frustration. He was impressed by the guard's incredible self-control and dedication to his duties, but he was also frustrated by his complete inability to get any kind of response or acknowledgement. It was like trying to communicate with a statue or a robot. The prince tried a different strategy and began telling the guard about his day. He talked about his lessons at school and what he had learned in his history class. He mentioned that he was studying about famous battles and great military leaders. He thought that talking about military topics might interest the guard and possibly get him to react. But Guard Thompson continued to maintain his perfect stillness and silence. William could see that the guard was breathing, and that his eyes would blink occasionally, but otherwise he showed no signs of being a living human being. The guard's discipline was so complete that it seemed almost supernatural. William spent over an hour trying different approaches with Guard Thompson. He tried being funny and telling jokes that usually made his friends laugh. He tried being serious and talking about important topics. He even tried being a bit silly and making funny faces when he thought no one else was looking. But nothing worked. The prince began to understand why the royal guards had such an impressive reputation. Their training must have been incredibly intense to produce this level of self-control. William started to wonder what kind of exercises and practice sessions the guards went through to develop such perfect discipline. As the morning wore on, other palace staff members began to notice William's unusual behavior. Some of the gardeners and maintenance workers would glance over at him occasionally as he continued his attempts to get the guards' attention, but they were all too polite and respectful to say anything or to interfere with what the prince was doing. William realized that he was running out of simple approaches. He had tried being polite and friendly. He had tried being casual and natural. He had tried being direct and purposeful. But nothing had worked to break through Guard Thompson's professional barrier. The young prince began to feel a new respect for the guard's training and dedication. He had always known that being a royal guard was an important job, but he had never fully understood how difficult it must be. Standing perfectly still and ignoring all distractions for hours at a time required incredible mental and physical strength. But William's curiosity was still not satisfied. He felt like he had only scratched the surface of what was possible. If simple approaches were not going to work, then he would need to try more creative and bold methods. He began to think about what he could do next that might finally get some kind of reaction from these seemingly unbreakable soldiers. As Guard Thompson's shift continued, William stepped back to observe and plan his next moves. He watched how the guard held his position and how he managed to maintain his focus despite all the distractions around him. The prince was beginning to realize that this was going to be a much bigger challenge than he had originally thought. William returned to his room feeling both defeated and more determined than ever. His first attempts with Guard Thompson had taught him that simple approaches would not work with these highly trained soldiers. He needed to think of more creative and interesting ways to test their limits. The young prince spent his lunch break planning new strategies that might finally get a reaction from the royal guards. After eating his meal, William decided to try his luck with Guard Mitchell, who had just started his afternoon shift. Guard Mitchell was younger than Thompson and had only been working at the palace for a few months. William thought that perhaps a less experienced guard might be easier to distract or surprise. Maybe the newer guards had not yet developed the same level of perfect self-control as the veterans. William approached Guard Mitchell's post with renewed confidence. This time he decided to try some of the entertaining methods that worked so well with his school friends. He began by telling some of his favorite jokes in a clear voice that the guard could easily hear. He started with simple, funny stories about things that had happened at Eton College. The prince told a joke about a teacher who had accidentally worn 2 different shoes to class and did not notice until a student pointed it out. He told another story about a classmate who had tried to impress a girl by doing a magic trick, but it ended up making his lunch disappear instead of the playing card. William used his best storytelling voice and added dramatic gestures to make the stories more entertaining. But Guard Mitchell showed no reaction whatsoever to William's jokes and stories. The young soldier stood as perfectly still as Guard Thompson had earlier in the day. His face remained completely serious, and his eyes stayed focused on their designated point in the distance. William began to realize that the guards' training was probably the same for all of them, regardless of how long they had been working. Feeling frustrated by the lack of response, William decided to try physical comedy instead of just telling jokes. He began doing exaggerated stretches and exercises near the guard post. He pretended that he was warming up for rugby practice and needed to stretch his muscles before playing. He did jumping jacks and push-ups and even some silly dance moves that he had seen on television. The prince made sure to stay within Guard Mitchell's view while he performed his impromptu exercise routine. He hoped that the unusual sight of a royal family member doing jumping jacks in the palace courtyard would be enough to break through the guard's professional composure. But Guard Mitchell continued to ignore him completely. William then decided to try practicing his public speaking skills in front of the guard. He had learned in school that practicing speeches in front of an audience was good preparation for real presentations. Since Guard Mitchell could not leave his post, he would be a perfect captive audience for William's practice sessions. The young prince began delivering mock speeches about various topics. He talked about the importance of education and how young people needed to work hard in school. He gave a passionate speech about environmental protection and why everyone should care about saving the planet. He even delivered a humorous speech about why chocolate should be considered a health food. William used all the public speaking techniques he had learned from his tutors. He varied his voice tone and volume. He used hand gestures to emphasize important points. He made eye contact with his audience even though that audience was just one silent guard. But despite his best efforts, Guard Mitchell showed no signs of being impressed or entertained by the speeches. The prince began to wonder if the guards were even allowed to show emotions while on duty. Maybe they would get in serious trouble if they were caught smiling or laughing or even looking interested in what was happening around them. William had heard that military discipline was very strict, and that soldiers could be punished for breaking rules even in small ways. This thought made William feel a bit guilty about what he was doing. He did not want to cause any trouble for the guards or put their jobs at risk. But his curiosity was still stronger than his guilt. He decided to continue his experiments, but to be more careful about not doing anything that might actually get the guards in trouble with their supervisors. William tried a different approach and began talking to Guard Mitchell about more serious topics. He discussed current events and news stories that he had read about in newspapers and magazines. He talked about sports and asked the guard if he followed any particular teams or players. He even tried discussing military history, thinking that this topic might be more interesting to a soldier. But Guard Mitchell maintained his perfect silence and stillness throughout all of William's attempts at conversation. The guard seemed to be completely cut off from the world around him. William began to wonder if the guards were trained to block out all sounds and distractions, or if they simply had incredible willpower. As the afternoon continued, William noticed that other people were starting to pay attention to his unusual behavior. Palace staff members would glance over at him curiously as they went about their work. Some tourists who were taking tours of the palace grounds also began to notice the young prince talking to himself near the guard post. William realized that he was probably looking quite strange to outside observers. Here he was a member of the royal family, spending hours trying to get attention from guards who were obviously not going to respond. But he had come too far to give up now. His teenage pride was at stake, and he felt like he needed to prove that no one was completely immune to distraction. The prince decided to try telling the guard about his personal life and experiences. He talked about what it was like growing up in the palace and how different his life was from normal teenagers. He mentioned some of the interesting people he had met and the unusual places he had traveled to with his family. William thought that sharing personal information might make him seem more human and relatable to the guard. Maybe if Guard Mitchell saw him as a regular person rather than just a prince, he would be more likely to respond in some way. But even these personal stories failed to get any reaction from the stoic soldier. The young prince began to run out of ideas for his current approach. He had tried humor and exercise in speeches and conversation and personal stories. Nothing had worked to break through Guard Mitchell's professional barrier. William started to realize that he would need to come up with even more creative and bold methods if he wanted to succeed in his mission. As Guard Mitchell's shift began to wind down, William took a step back to evaluate his progress so far. He had learned that both experienced and new guards seemed to have the same level of perfect self-control. Their training was clearly very thorough and effective, but William was not ready to admit defeat yet. The prince began to think about what he could try next that would be different from everything he had already attempted. He needed something more surprising and unexpected. Something that would really test the limits of the guards' training and discipline. William felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he began to plan his next phase of experiments. William spent the evening in his room planning what he thought would be his most daring attempts yet. He had learned from his earlier experiments that ordinary methods would not work with the royal guards. These men were trained to ignore normal distractions and conversations. If he wanted to get any kind of reaction, he would need to try something truly unexpected and bold. The next morning, William approached Guard Harrison, who was starting his shift at the main entrance. Guard Harrison was a middle-aged soldier with many years of experience and a small scar on his chin that made him look quite distinguished. William had observed this particular guard many times and knew that he was considered one of the most reliable and professional soldiers in the unit. William decided to begin his new approach by discussing topics that most people would find fascinating or shocking. He started talking about recent news events and scandals that had been reported in the newspapers. He thought that sharing gossip and interesting stories might finally capture the guard's attention and make him want to respond. The young prince talked about celebrity scandals and political controversies that everyone in the country was discussing. He shared details about famous people who had gotten into trouble and businesses that had failed in dramatic ways. William made sure to include all the most interesting and surprising details that would normally make people want to ask questions or share their own opinions. But Guard Harrison remained completely unmoved by these usually captivating topics. His expression stayed serious and professional. His eyes continued to focus on their designated point without wavering. William began to realize that even the most interesting news and gossip in the world could not break through the guard's mental discipline. Feeling frustrated but not defeated, William decided to try talking about the royal family itself. He thought that surely the guards would be interested in hearing inside information about the people they were protecting. He began sharing stories about palace life that most people would never get to hear. William talked about funny things that happened during formal dinners and state ceremonies. He described the personalities of various royal family members and shared amusing stories about their private conversations and interactions. He even mentioned some of the minor disagreements and personality conflicts that occurred behind palace walls. The prince thought that this inside information would be too tempting for any normal person to ignore. These were the kinds of secrets that tabloid newspapers would pay huge amounts of money to learn about. But Guard Harrison showed no signs of interest or curiosity about any of the royal family stories. William then tried discussing more personal topics about his own life and feelings. He talked about the pressures and challenges of being a young prince. He described how difficult it was to live up to everyone's expectations and how lonely it could sometimes feel to be so different from other teenagers. The young prince shared his worries about the future and his concerns about whether he would be able to handle the responsibilities that would come with his position. He talked about his relationship with his parents and his brother, and how complicated family dynamics could be when you lived in the public eye. William hoped that hearing about his personal struggles and emotions would make the guards see him as a real person rather than just a royal figure. He thought that Guard Harrison might feel some sympathy or connection that would cause him to break his professional facade, even for just a moment. But the experienced soldier continued to maintain his perfect composure throughout William's emotional revelations. Guard Harrison seemed to be completely immune to any form of human connection or sympathy while he was on duty. His training had apparently taught him to separate his personal feelings from his professional responsibilities. William decided to try a completely different strategy and began asking the guard direct questions about his own life and experiences. He asked about Guard Harrison's family and whether he had children or a wife at home. He inquired about the guard's hobbies and interests and what he liked to do when he was not working at the palace. The prince asked about the guard's military background and training. He wanted to know how someone became a royal guard and what kind of tests and qualifications were required. William thought that showing genuine interest in the guard's career and personal life might finally get him to respond with at least a few words. But Guard Harrison maintained his complete silence throughout all of William's questions. The guard seemed to have been trained to treat any attempt at conversation as if it simply did not exist. William began to understand that the guards were probably instructed never to engage with anyone while on duty, regardless of who that person was. Feeling increasingly desperate to get some kind of reaction, William decided to try his most shocking approach yet. He began talking about controversial and sensitive topics that would normally make anyone feel uncomfortable or want to respond. He discussed political issues and social problems that were causing debates and disagreements throughout the country. The young prince shared his own opinions about various controversial subjects and tried to present arguments that would normally provoke strong reactions from most people. He talked about topics that his tutors had warned him to avoid in public because they were too sensitive or divisive. William hoped that by discussing these provocative subjects, he could finally push Guard Harrison beyond his limits of self-control. Surely there had to be some topic or opinion that would make the guard want to respond or at least show some kind of emotional reaction. But once again, Guard Harrison proved to be completely unshakable. No topic seemed too controversial or sensitive to break through his professional discipline. The guard continued to stand perfectly still and silent, as if William's words were just meaningless noise in the background. As William's latest attempts continued to fail, he began to feel a growing respect for the incredible mental strength and training of the royal guards. These men had clearly undergone extensive preparation that taught them to block out all external distractions and influences. Their ability to maintain focus and composure was truly remarkable. But William was also feeling more frustrated than ever. He had now tried humor and personal stories and controversial topics and direct questions. He had shared inside information and emotional revelations and provocative opinions. Nothing had worked to get even the smallest reaction from any of the guards he had tested. The young prince began to wonder if his mission was actually impossible. Maybe the royal guards really were as perfectly disciplined as everyone believed. Maybe their training was so complete and thorough that they truly could not be distracted or influenced by anything that happened around them. However, William's teenage stubbornness would not let him give up completely. He felt like he had invested too much time and effort into this experiment to quit now. There had to be some way to break through the guards' defenses. He just needed to think of something even more creative and unexpected than anything he had tried so far. As Guard Harrison's shift continued, William began to observe the soldier more carefully than ever before. He watched for any tiny signs of human reaction or emotion. He looked for small movements or changes in breathing or blinking patterns that might indicate that his words were having some effect, even if the guard was trying to hide it. William noticed that Guard Harrison was indeed a living, breathing human being, despite his statue-like appearance. The guard would blink occasionally, and William could see his chest moving slightly as he breathed. But these were the only signs of life that the guard allowed himself to show while on duty. William had been trying for 3 days to get any reaction from the Royal Guards and was beginning to feel defeated. His most creative and bold attempts had all failed completely. The guards seemed to be immune to every form of distraction and influence he could think of. But the young prince was not ready to give up entirely. He decided to make one final attempt with a different approach. On the 4th day, William chose to focus his attention on Guard Thompson again. He had started his experiment with this experienced soldier and wanted to end it with him as well. William positioned himself near the guard post with what he planned to be his last and most desperate strategy. Instead of trying to get a reaction, William decided to simply talk to Guard Thompson as if he was having a normal conversation with a friend. He did not expect any responses or acknowledgments. He just wanted to share his thoughts and feelings with someone who would listen, even if they could not respond. William began talking about his school experiences and the subjects he was studying. He described his favorite teachers and the classes he found most interesting. He talked about his friends at Eton and the activities they enjoyed doing together during their free time. The prince spoke in a calm, relaxed voice as if he was chatting with an old friend. As William continued his one-sided conversation, he began to feel more comfortable and natural. He was no longer trying to shock or surprise the guard. He was simply sharing his life and experiences with someone who happened to be there. This felt much better than all his previous attempts to force a reaction. The young prince talked about his dreams and plans for the future. He discussed the responsibilities he would have as he got older and how he hoped to make a positive difference in the world. William shared his concerns about living up to the expectations that came with being part of the royal family. Guard Thompson continued to maintain his professional stance throughout William's peaceful monologue. But something seemed different about the atmosphere between them. Even though the guard was not responding, William felt like he was actually being heard and understood for the first time during his entire experiment. William began talking about his appreciation for the guards who protected his family. He said that he had always taken their presence for granted, but now understood how difficult and important their job really was. The prince expressed genuine gratitude for their service and dedication. As William spoke about his newfound respect for the royal guards, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A gentle breeze had started blowing through the palace. Courtyard and some papers from William's school bag began to scatter in the wind. The loose sheets were flying directly toward Guard Thompson. Without thinking about his training or professional requirements, Guard Thompson made a slight movement with his hand. It was barely noticeable and lasted only a fraction of a second, but his natural human instinct to help had caused him to react to the flying papers. The movement was so small that most people would have missed it completely. But William had been watching so carefully and for so long that he caught the tiny gesture immediately. His eyes widened with excitement and surprise. After days of trying everything he could think of, he had finally gotten a reaction from one of the royal guards. It was not the dramatic response he had originally hoped for, but it was something real and human. In that brief moment, Guard Thompson seemed to realize what had happened. His eyes flickered down to meet William's gaze for just an instant. There was a look of understanding, and perhaps even a hint of amusement in the guard's expression. It was as if he was acknowledging both William's persistence and his own momentary lapse in discipline. The connection between the prince and the guard lasted only a few seconds, but it felt significant to both of them. William realized that he had finally seen the human being behind the uniform and training. Guard Thompson was not a robot or a statue. He was a real person with natural instincts and emotions who was simply very good at controlling them while on duty. William felt a rush of triumph mixed with a new understanding and respect. He had succeeded in his mission to get a reaction from the Royal Guards, but the victory felt different than he had expected. Instead of feeling proud of breaking through the guards' defenses, he felt grateful for the brief moment of human connection they had shared. From that day forward, William's relationship with the Royal Guards changed completely. He no longer saw them as challenges to be conquered or puzzles to be solved. Instead, he began to appreciate them as dedicated professionals who deserved his respect and gratitude. The young prince started greeting the guards politely when he passed by their posts. He did not expect them to respond, but he wanted to acknowledge them as human beings rather than just part of the palace furniture. William would say good morning or good afternoon in a friendly voice and sometimes comment on the weather or wish them a pleasant day. The guards continued to maintain their professional silence and composure, but William thought he could sometimes detect subtle signs that they appreciated his courtesy. There might be a barely noticeable nod or a slight change in posture that suggested they had heard and acknowledged his greetings. William's failed experiment had taught him valuable lessons about discipline, respect, and human nature. He learned that true strength came not from breaking others down but from understanding and appreciating their dedication and professionalism. The guards were not emotionless machines but highly trained individuals who took their responsibilities very seriously. The prince also gained a new understanding of what it meant to serve others. The royal guard stood for hours in all kinds of weather, protecting his family without expecting recognition or appreciation. Their commitment to duty was something William began to admire and respect rather than challenge. Years later, when William became an adult and took on more royal responsibilities, he would often think back to his experiment with the guards. The experience had taught him about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or role in society. William learned that everyone deserved to be seen as a complete human being with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. The guards were not just there for his entertainment or curiosity. They were professionals doing an important job that required incredible sacrifice and dedication. The brief moment of connection he had shared with Guard Thompson became one of William's most treasured memories from his teenage years. It reminded him that even in the most formal and structured environments, human warmth and understanding could still exist. The tiny gesture of reaching for the flying papers had revealed the caring person behind the uniform. As William grew older and wiser, he would often tell this story to others as an example of how important it was to look beyond appearances and roles, to see the real people underneath. His failed attempt to break the guards' discipline had actually succeeded in teaching him something much more valuable about respect, empathy, and human dignity. The royal guards continued to protect the palace and the royal family with the same dedication and professionalism they had always shown. But William now saw them through different eyes. He understood that their silence and stillness were not signs of coldness or indifference, but expressions of their commitment to serving others with honor and excellence.